I think that with regard to the Tea Party movement, one of the problems is essentially, I would say, a problem with any large-scale movement. A set of ideas that may initially start out fairly sophisticated, well-defined, well-intentioned becomes diluted and tainted with other things when it is dispersed to a mass following.
Well, it's like playing a game of telephone, of course. Some of the messages will be misinterpreted, and people will generally clamber onto the little bits of the message that they can understand, which generally aren't the best bits of the message.
I think the best parallel actually may be what happened during the French Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
Where the initial impetus for the revolution was the Enlightenment and its recognition of the extreme injustices of the Bourbon monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
However...
And that part was good.
Yes.
Good going so far.
It started out with some justified constitutional reforms, constraints on the king's prerogative, some representative government, freedom for the Third Estate, but it became associated with these murderous Jacobin egalitarian ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Where essentially there was the mob and there was the Committee of Public Safety that manipulated the mob into getting rid of its political enemies and ultimately dissenters within itself.
Again, it was something very nationalistic and fascistic, and that's the same sort of thing we see happening with the Tea Party now. Tea Party began with Ron Paul's revolution, which was a very libertarian, very freedom-centered movement. A whole bunch of people campaigning for things like drug legalization and other social freedoms as well as economic freedoms. But then you have it being taken over gradually by nationalists and religious fanatics, and you begin to see a deterioration of that freedom and a deterioration of the message of the movement.
There is, for instance, a strong anti-immigration strain in
Yes.
the Tea Party movement. There is a little bit of an anti-Semitic strain. There have been some accusations of racism by the NAACP. I think they paint the Tea Party movement with too broad a brush, but there certainly are some racists who like to associate themselves with that movement.
There are plenty of racists in the Tea Party movement. I'd say a higher proportion than in the general population, just because for a lot of people, the Tea Party ideals give them an excuse to cover their racism. And it's really sad, because a lot of Tea Partiers aren't racists. I'd say most of them aren't, but there are some who use it as cover.
And it seems to me that what's necessary in this case is to keep one's distance from these kinds of elements that try to co-opt a movement. A good way to keep one's distance from such elements is just to focus on particular issues. Well, if the Tea Party movement opposes bailouts or unreasonably high taxes or a regime of obsessive security as we have today, or foreign policy interventionism to the extent that exists in Afghanistan and Iraq, they could frame a core set of issues that they want to target and then say, if you agree with us on these issues, we don't care what else you believe. We don't care what your views are on religion, on immigration, etc. Just, if you agree with us here, that's the Tea Party. Everything else is not Tea Party, it's not anti-Tea Party, it's just your opinion.
Well, the problem is that you're making it sound like it's all perfectly thought out and rational on the part of these Tea Partiers, and I would say that a huge amount of it is actually purely emotional. People saw Ron Paul's revolution and grabbed onto a few ideas that Ron Paul was espousing that they agreed with. They heard certain keywords like founders and freedom and income taxes are bad, and they were like, yeah, let's join that party. And then they join it and they begin diluting that higher level of discourse with a lot of these terribly inflammatory bits of rhetoric. You can't talk to a Tea Partier and attempt to argue with them because you'll end up getting shouted down. Look at just what's on their signs. I mean, it's not slogans about the importance of this or that phrased in civil and clever ways. It's always really inflammatory things like, Obama is a socialist Muslim. You know? That was a real sign.
Yes.
And it's just so sad to see the level of discourse brought down to that level. when we should be sitting and talking about the reasons behind X, Y, or Z and why that's the best or worst thing to do. You can't have those kinds of conversations with the sort of people that the Tea Party attracts. There's just a lot of anger, and these people feel that by joining this movement, they can acquire some kind of voice in the political process, even if it's only a vent for their anger.
Yes, unfortunately, anger alone never solves political problems. It often exacerbates them.
Which is what we're seeing with what was Ron Paul's revolution and is now the Tea Party.
There is a lot of political
Fear
abuse
leads to
today.
anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate will lead to suffering if the Tea Party gets their way.